In the dim, gaslit streets of 1929 Düsseldorf, terror lurked in the shadows. Women and children whisper a phantom, a predator that moved unseen, striking with sudden, merciless violence. They called him the Vampire of Düsseldorf, a monster who drank the blood of his victims. And one cold spring evening, a young girl named Maria Hahn vanished, leaving behind only a single, blood-stained ribbon tangled in the undergrowth near the Rhine. Düsseldorf in the late 1920s was a city teetering on the edge of darkness. The aftermath of World War I had left Germany in economic ruin, with inflation soaring and desperation seeping into the cobbled streets. The once thriving industrial hub now bore the scars of war: crumbling buildings, beggars on every corner, and a population grasping for stability in an uncertain future. But no one could predict that amid this chaos, something far worse was taking shape, a presence more terrifying than the war itself. The first sign of the horror came in February 1929, when a housemaid named Apollonia Kuhn survived a brutal attack. A man had lured her into a dark alley, only to stab her repeatedly before vanishing into the night. She lived, but her testimony only deepened the mystery. She described her attacker as an ordinary-looking man, unremarkable, almost forgettable, but there was something in his eyes. She said something that made her stomach turn. No one suspected Peter Kürten at first. A 45-year-old man with a quiet demeanor, Kürten blended into the city's working-class districts without raising an eyebrow. He was married, well-dressed, and outwardly polite, hardly the image of a bloodthirsty killer. But beneath his mild exterior lurked a predator who had spent decades perfecting his craft. Kürten's crimes stretched back further than anyone imagined. Born in 1883 into a brutal household, he endured relentless beatings from his alcoholic father. Violence became his second nature. By the time he was a teenager, he had already committed his first murder, pushing a schoolmate into a river and watching him drown, feeling nothing but pleasure at the boy's struggles. By 1929, his thirst for blood had escalated to something far more grotesque. He didn't just kill, he savored the act. He whispered soothing words to his victims before delivering the fatal blow. And in the most chilling detail of all, he sometimes drank from their wounds, relishing the warm, coppery taste of their blood. The city's police force scrambled to make sense of the mounting attacks. A string of bodies, women, children, even men, began appearing in parks, abandoned lots, and riverbanks. Each crime was more brutal than the last. In one case, a 5-year-old girl was found strangled and stabbed, her tiny body discarded like garbage. In another, a man was ambushed from behind, his skull shattered with a hammer before his attacker melted back into the night. Despite the rising panic, Kürten remained elusive. He chose his victims at random, attacked in broad daylight, and vanished before anyone could react. Witnesses described different men, sometimes a tall, thin figure, other times a stocky brute with a thick mustache. The conflicting reports only added to the chaos. And then there was Maria Hahn. Maria, a 22-year-old housemaid, had been lured into Kürten's grasp under the pretense of a pleasant outing. She had no idea she was stepping into the clutches of a killer. Kürten led her into the countryside, charming her with small talk before his demeanor suddenly changed. His smile vanished. His eyes darkened. What happened next was beyond comprehension. Hours later, Kürten emerged alone. He was calm, his clothes barely disheveled. But in the secluded grove he left behind, Maria's mutilated body lay hidden beneath a blanket of fallen leaves. Her throat had been cut, and in a macabre ritual, Kürten had pressed his lips to the wound, drinking deeply before walking away as if nothing had happened. Days later, her family reported her missing, but no trace of Maria was found, until Kürten himself sent an anonymous letter to the police, detailing the exact location of her body. It was a twisted game, a way for him to relive his crime through the terror he sowed. By the time authorities realized the extent of the terror, the body count had reached double digits. The people of Düsseldorf were afraid to walk the streets, locking their doors at night and eyeing every stranger with suspicion. Yet, Kürten remained untouchable, until one fateful night in May 1930. A young woman named Maria Budlik had a chance encounter with him, but unlike his previous victims, she escaped. Terrified but determined, she went straight to the police. She described a man who had led her to his apartment, attempting to attack her before she managed to flee. The description was chillingly precise. Authorities traced her story back to an unassuming apartment, and there they found Kürten. But what happened next was even more shocking. Kürten did not run. He did not fight. Instead, he calmly admitted to his crimes, his confession spilling forth in horrifying detail. He spoke of his pleasure in killing, his need to drink blood, his compulsion to hear the dying gasps of his victims. And as the detective sat frozen in disbelief, Kürten leaned forward and asked, almost casually, "Tell me, when they behead me, will I still be able to hear the blood gushing from my neck?" Peter Kürten's reign of terror had finally come to an end, but his twisted legacy, the fear, the horror, the monstrous acts, would haunt Düsseldorf forever. And as the executioner sharpened his blade, Kürten's final question lingered in the air. Peter Kürten leaned forward, his lips curling into a ghost of a smile. "Tell me," he asked, his voice eerily calm, "when they behead me, will I still be able to hear the blood gushing from my neck?" The room fell silent. The detectives, sitting across from him, barely breathed. They had interrogated murderers before, thieves, brutes, even those who killed in fits of rage. But Kürten was different. He spoke not with remorse, nor even arrogance, but with curiosity, as if his execution was just another step in a grand experiment of horror. And yet, despite his chilling confessions, something was unsettling about it all. Something didn't add up. For hours, Kürten unraveled his web of atrocities, detailing each murder with cold precision. He described the victims, their final moments, their pleas for mercy. He spoke of the blood, the thrill, the sound of life slipping away. But then, contradictions began to appear. Dates blurred. Descriptions wavered. Some details of the crimes he claimed to have committed did not match the forensic reports. He described stabbing one victim in the chest, but the autopsy revealed a slit throat. He insisted he had killed another near the river, but her body had been found miles away in an abandoned lot. Detectives exchanged uneasy glances. Was he lying, or was there something far more sinister at play? Then came the most disturbing revelation of all. Kürten described in vivid detail a murder police had never made public: the brutal slaying of a woman named Gertrude Hammaker. She had been found in a secluded garden, her throat savagely cut. The crime had been attributed to the Vampire of Düsseldorf, but Kürten's version didn't match the evidence. And yet, the real killer had never been caught. As news of Kürten's arrest spread, the people of Düsseldorf breathed a sigh of relief. The monster had been caged. The nightmare was over, or so they thought. Just days after his confession, another body was discovered. A young woman, murdered in a manner eerily similar to Kürten's crimes. Strangled, her body left in the shadows of a public park. The newspapers exploded with speculation. Had Kürten lied about being the sole killer? Had someone else been lurking in the darkness alongside him all along? Or, more disturbingly, had Kürten's arrest emboldened a copycat? As detectives combed through the evidence, another problem arose, one that sent chills through the investigation. Several key police reports had vanished. Detailed records of crime scenes, witness statements, and forensic notes on the Vampire of Düsseldorf's earliest victims were simply gone. Files that should have been locked in the station's archives had disappeared without a trace. Was it incompetence, a clerical error, or something more deliberate? Had someone within the police force erased parts of Kürten's past? Then a breakthrough, one that raised more questions than answers. An unsigned letter arrived at police headquarters, written in shaky, uneven script. "You have the wrong man. The real horror is still out there. Look deeper. The blood you seek is hidden beneath the earth." Detectives rushed to trace the letter's origin, but it had been posted from an anonymous drop box. No fingerprints, no witnesses. But the most terrifying part? It had been delivered before the latest murder. Someone had known another victim would die before she was even found. With panic rising, the authorities were under immense pressure. The people of Düsseldorf, who had believed themselves free of terror, were beginning to fear they had celebrated too soon. The newspapers speculated wildly. Was Kürten part of a larger network of killers? Was he covering for someone? Was a real vampire still out there, laughing at the city's desperation? One thing was certain. Kürten was enjoying the chaos. In his prison cell, he remained eerily calm, as if he had expected all of this. He toyed with investigators, sometimes claiming he was a sole killer, other times suggesting an accomplice lurked in the shadows. Detectives asked him about the missing files. He only smiled. They asked him about the unsigned letter. He chuckled and leaned in close. You think I'm the only one who enjoys the taste of blood? Then, just as the investigation reached its breaking point, another body was found. But this time, it wasn't a victim. It was a grave, buried deep in a wooded area outside Düsseldorf. Police uncovered human remains that had been there for years, decayed beyond recognition, but unmistakably murdered in the same grotesque fashion as Kürten's victims. The problem? Kürten had been in prison at the time of this person's death. The discovery sent a ripple of dread through the city. If Kürten hadn't killed this victim, who had? Was it possible the Vampire Düsseldorf was merely a piece of something larger, something darker? And as detectives sifted through the remains, they found something buried alongside the bones. A letter, torn and yellow with age. Its message was short but chilling. You're looking in the wrong place. The letter, torn and yellow with age, lay in the detective's trembling hands. Asterisk, you are looking in the wrong place. Asterisk, for a moment, the world inside the dense forest stood still. The skeletal remains in the shallow grave told one horrifying story, but the letter, buried alongside the bones, told another. Detective Ernst Bohm swallowed hard. He had been chasing Kürten's ghost for months, dissecting the twisted mind of a monster. But this was something else. How could a letter, buried years ago, predict the future? And worse, who had written it? The grave had been hastily dug, the earth packed loosely as if someone had been in a hurry. But the body itself, whoever they had been, was arranged with eerie precision, arms folded across the chest, head tilted slightly to the left. The bones, stripped of flesh by time, were unsettlingly clean. Bohm crouched down, his breath visible in the cold air. His fingers brushed against something else in the dirt. Another scrap of paper, this one crumpled and partially burned. He carefully unfolded it. There were only 3 words, scrawled in smeared ink. Asterisk, do not dig. Asterisk, a chill ran down his spine. Who had buried this body? And why did they want it to stay hidden? Back at headquarters, the weight of the discovery bore down on the investigation. If Kürten hadn't committed this murder, who had? And was the letter a warning or a taunt? Then, just as the pieces were beginning to align, the case took another shocking turn. A key informant, an ex-prostitute named Frida Keller, had promised to give testimony linking Kürten to additional murders. She had claimed to have seen him with victims mere hours before their deaths, claims that could solidify his conviction. But on the morning of her scheduled testimony, Frida vanished. Her rented apartment was empty. The bed was unmade, and a half-eaten meal sat on the table. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no forced entry. It was as if she had simply stepped out and never returned. A neighbor reported seeing a man in a dark coat lingering near her building the night before. Was it Kürten's accomplice? A desperate act to silence her? Or had Frida been lying all along? Days later, another letter arrived at the station, this one addressed directly to Detective Bohm. It was written in the same uneven script as the note found in the grave. Asterisk, you are pulling at threads that should remain untouched. Asterisk, asterisk, Frida is gone because she spoke too much. If you speak too much, you will join her. Asterisk, the warning was clear. Someone was watching the investigation closely. Someone who had gone to great lengths to keep the past buried. Bohm clenched the letter in his fist. Was this about Kürten? Or had they stumbled onto something far worse? Determined not to be intimidated, Bohm and his team doubled down on the case. They scoured old records, searching for connections between Kürten and the newly discovered body. Then, buried deep in the Düsseldorf police archives, they found something extraordinary, an old ledger from 1913, a year marked by another string of brutal murders. The killings from that year bore the same grotesque signatures, random victims, sudden attacks, eerie precision. But there was one major difference. Peter Kürten had been in prison at the time, which meant there had been another vampire. And now, more than a decade later, the two cases were bleeding together. As pressure mounted, so did the obstacles. A senior officer, one who had long been skeptical of Bohm's theories, suddenly ordered the investigation into the newly found grave closed. Officially, the victim's identity was deemed unrecoverable. The body was to be buried in a pauper's grave. The evidence collected from the scene mysteriously disappeared from the evidence room. Someone with the power wanted this case buried. But why? And what were they trying to hide? Hashtag, 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 a house of horrors. Desperate for answers, Bohm turned to an unlikely source. Kürten himself. If there was a deeper mystery at play, perhaps the Vampire of Düsseldorf had been more than just a lone killer. Perhaps he knew what the police were never meant to find. Visiting him in his cell, Bohm laid out the latest discoveries. The new murder, the old killings from 1913, the grave, the letters. Kürten listened, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he laughed. A low, amused chuckle that sent shivers down Bohm's spine. "I told you," Kürten murmured, leaning in, his breath warm against the cold metal bars. "I was never the only one." Bohm stared. "What do you mean?" Kürten smiled. "You think I was the first to enjoy the taste of blood in this city? The first to hear the whispers of the ones who came before? Düsseldorf has always had a monster." He sat back, tapping a finger against his temple. "You've been digging in the wrong place. But don't worry, the right place isn't far." He smiled again. "It's just beneath your feet." Bohm left the prison shaken, Kürten's words echoing in his mind. "You've been digging in the wrong place. But don't worry, the right place isn't far. It's just beneath your feet." Hours later, he and his team arrived at a crumbling, long-abandoned house in the heart of Düsseldorf, an address pulled from old records, a place Kürten had briefly lived in years before. The house had been boarded up for decades. Dust coated the windows. Rats scurried through the foundation. But as soon as they entered, an unmistakable smell hit them. Rot. They followed the stench to the parlor, where the floorboards, old and warped, creaked beneath their boots. With a crowbar, Bohm pried one up, then another, and beneath the wooden planks, in a crawl space untouched by time, the truth lay waiting. Rows of bones, dozens of skeletons. Some of them are nearly ancient. Some of them are fresh. And in the center of it all, pinned beneath a rusted dagger, was another letter. It had only 2 words. Asterisk, still hungry. Asterisk. The house on Mullenstrasse had become a tomb. Detective Ernst Bohm stood frozen, staring at the horror beneath the floorboards. The crawl space stretched into darkness, packed with bones. Dozens, maybe hundreds, some ancient, some disturbingly fresh. The smell of rot clawed at his throat, and his fingers trembled as he reached for the final letter, the one pinned beneath the rusted dagger. Still hungry. His pulse thundered. This was no longer just Kürten's legacy. This was something older, something worse. The city trembles. Within hours, the discovery spread across Düsseldorf like wildfire. The newspapers abandoned their lurid tales of Kürten's confessions. This was bigger, darker. A house of death. Who came before Kürten? The city's secret graveyard. Has a second killer been at work? Rumors churned. Some claimed Kürten had a mentor, someone who had taught him the art of murder. Others whispered that Düsseldorf had always harbored a hidden evil, a cycle of blood that returned generation after generation. And then some believed something else entirely, that the Vampire of Düsseldorf had never been a man at all. Bohm and his team scoured old police archives, searching for any trace of earlier murders connected to the house. The further they dug, the more unsettling the pattern became. 1870, 3 bodies were found dismembered near Mullenstrasse. 1899, a family of 5 vanished. The father, a butcher, was blamed and hanged, but the bodies were never found. 1913, a string of killings eerily similar to Kürten's. The murderer was never caught. And now, decades later, more bodies are beneath the floorboards. Had Kürten inherited the violence? Had he stumbled upon something buried and fed into it? Or had something found him? Then a breakthrough, An elderly woman, Clara Hofstad, came forward after reading about the bones in the newspaper. Her voice shook as she told her story. "When I was a girl," she whispered, "we used to play near that house, but we never went too close. The grown-ups said bad things happened there." "What kind of bad things?" Bone pressed. She hesitated. Then her voice dropped to a whisper. "My grandmother, she used to say there was a man who lived there a long time ago. A man who didn't age. He always wore gloves, even in the summer, and he only came out at night." Bohm exhaled sharply. This wasn't evidence. It was folklore, but in a case like this, where fact bled into myth, even old ghost stories could hold truth. And then Clara said something that made his blood run cold. "My grandmother told me his name." Bohm leaned in. She said he was called Johann Keller. Bohm returned to the archives, searching for any trace of Johann Keller. At first, nothing. No criminal records, no census entries, no property deeds. Then, deep in a forgotten ledger, he found it. 1871. A Johann Keller had owned the house on Mullenstrasse, but there was no death certificate, no record of him leaving. It was as if he had simply vanished. But his house had remained, and so had the bodies, with the weight of history bearing down on him. Bohm had only one place left to turn. Kürten. He returned to the prison, determined to push the Vampire of Düsseldorf for answers. Kürten sat in his cell, eerily calm, hands folded in his lap. He regarded Bohm with amusement, as if expecting him. "You've been busy," Kürten murmured, "digging where you shouldn't." Bohm didn't hesitate. "Johann Keller. Who is he?" Kürten's lips curled into a slow smile. "I wonder when you find his name." For the first time, Bohm saw something in Kürten's eyes, fear. "Keller was before me," Kürten whispered. "He was before all of us, the first to drink." He leaned forward. "I didn't start this." His voice was soft, almost reverent. "I only continued it." Bohm's stomach twisted. "You're saying Keller was a killer? That he lived in that house?" Kürten chuckled. "Lived? No, that's the wrong word. He never left." Bohm clenched his fists. "Keller is dead, Kürten." A pause. Then Kürten's smile widened. "Are you sure?" Bohm didn't sleep that night. Kürten was a liar, a manipulator. And yet, the weight of the case was suffocating. The missing records, the cycle of killings. The letter seemed to predict the future. Somewhere in the city, the truth lurked, and Bohm knew where he had to go. At dawn, he returned to Mullenstrasse. The house had been cordoned off, but he had a key. The city had abandoned this place for years. But now, it felt as if the house itself was waiting. He stepped inside. The air was thick and heavy with dust and something else. Something old. Bohm turned on his lantern, sweeping the light across the rotting furniture. The walls, covered in peeling wallpaper, seemed to breathe. The house had seen too much death. And then, a creak, not from the floorboards, from upstairs. Bohm's heart pounded. The house was supposed to be empty, but he wasn't alone. He reached for his revolver, inching toward the staircase. Each step groaned beneath his weight. Another creak. A shadow flickered at the end of the hallway. And then, a whisper. Not a voice, not words, but the unmistakable sensation of something breathing. His pulse thundered. He raised a lantern and froze. In the darkness of the hallway stood a man, tall, unmoving, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his gloved hands resting at his sides. His face was lost in shadow. Bohm's breath hitched. His grip tightened on the gun. The man didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Then, a smile, small, subtle. A curl of the lips sent ice into Bohm's veins. And in that instant he knew. The stories were true. The bodies beneath the house. The missing records. The legacy of blood. Johann Keller had never left. The lantern flickered. The shadows shifted. And Bohm's scream echoed through the empty house. Detective Ernst Bohm was found hours later, collapsed just outside the house on Mullenstrasse. His face was pale, his breath shallow. His gun was still in his hand, but the chamber was full. He hadn't fired a single shot. When his fellow officers arrived, they found the house as empty as it had always been, except for one thing. A single old-fashioned glove lay on the floor at the top of the stairs. The case against Peter Kürten had always been monstrous, but now it had mutated into something unthinkable. The city whispered. Had the vampire of Düsseldorf truly acted alone? Or had something older, something worse, been watching all along? The trial of a monster. Despite the growing rumors of another killer, the world was still fixated on Kürten. His trial began in April 1931, drawing enormous crowds. Spectators, reporters, and even morbid thrill-seekers packed the courtroom, desperate to see the man who had terrorized Düsseldorf. Kürten, for his part, relished the attention. He recounted his crimes with unsettling calm, sometimes even smiling as he described his victims' final moments. He admitted to drinking their blood, to reliving their deaths in his dreams. But when asked about the house on Mullenstrasse, his demeanor shifted. "I have nothing to say about that," he murmured. It was the only time he refused to speak. On July 2nd, 1931, the verdict was delivered, death by guillotine. Kürten remained unshaken. His only request before the execution was simple but disturbing. "Will I still be able to hear the blood gushing from my neck after my head is removed? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." And on July 2nd, 1931, Peter Kürten was beheaded. The vampire of Düsseldorf was dead, but the horrors he unearthed were not. After Kürten's execution, authorities attempted to put the past to rest. The house on Mullenstrasse was sealed. The bones beneath its floorboards were exhumed, but only a few were ever identified. Some had been buried for decades, others much longer. As for Johann Keller, no death certificate, no burial record, as if he had never existed at all. The case was officially closed. Kürten alone took the blame, but those who lived near the house knew better. The house remained empty for years. No one wanted to live there. Parents warned their children to stay away, whispering that the ground itself was cursed. Then, in 1943, during an Allied bombing raid, the house was finally destroyed. Or, at least, that's what people believed. In the aftermath, when survivors combed through the wreckage, they found something chilling, untouched, and scathed, as if no bomb had ever touched it. And inside, beneath the shattered beams and rubble, the floorboards remained, intact, sealed, never disturbed. No one dared dig again. To this day, Düsseldorf locals say the street where the house once stood is cursed. Some claim to hear whispers at night. Others say if you stand too long in the old lot, your breath will turn cold, even in summer. And every few years, another rumor emerges. A man in old-fashioned clothes, wearing gloves, standing on a quiet street, watching, waiting. Peter Kürten was a monster, a sadist, a murderer who bathed in the suffering of his victims. But was he the only one? The bodies beneath the house suggested otherwise. The missing records, the stories are passed down for generations. What if the vampire of Düsseldorf wasn't born, but chosen? What if the horrors of Mullenstrasse never ended, only continued? And most terrifying of all, what if they still do? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most chilling true crime cases, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Let me know your thoughts. Was Peter Kürten truly the only monster lurking in Düsseldorf, or is there more to the story than we'll ever know? Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And if you have a case you'd like me to cover next, drop it in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.